I'm Tom Standage, Deputy Editor at The Economist, and I'm delighted to introduce our panel of experts to discuss this topic. Joining me today, we have Alistair Denniston, who is Digital Lead for Research and Innovation at University Hospitals Birmingham and Director of Insight HDR UK. Also, Sylvia Richardson, CBE, Director of the MRC Biostatistics Unit at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Amrita Kumar, Consultant Radiologist and AI Clinical Lead at the Frimley Health NHS Foundation Trust, and Professor Paul Elliott, who is the Chair in Epidemiology and Public Health Medicine at Imperial College London. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. I'm going to start by having a brief chat with each of the panelists so we all understand a bit about their perspective and where they're coming from. Then we'll open up to a discussion and then we'll take some questions from the audience too. Please don't wait till the end of the session to send in your questions. Please send them in as they occur to you so we can see them and we can other people can upvote them and so forth. Dr. Amrita Kumar, perhaps I could start with you. You're very much on the front line of this. So how would you characterize the state at the moment of AI deployment as you see it?
Thank you, Tom. So I'm a consultant radiologist at an NHS trust. And actually our journey into AI started just before the pandemic, where as a breast cancer screening specialist, we were having some workforce challenges in terms of having adequate number of consultant radiology readers for our screening mammograms, which take place for all the ladies between ages of 50 and 73 every 3 years. And that made us look towards how we could solve those challenges. Skill mix was one of the ways to train up our mammographers, but AI had entered the conferences and the general medical field as one of the low-hanging fruit because of the clinical priority, the fact that this particular pathway had two clinicians and there was scope to replace one of those clinicians with AI, we started looking into it. Interestingly, we found that the research that was there showed the accuracy and effectiveness in a research setting, but we didn't really have any real life evidence in terms of implementation to show what the true value was, whether it was the work flow, the clinicians or the patient. And that led us to start addressing how an NHS trust could set up a more system-wide sort of strategic level infrastructure to really aid in the real world workflow implementation of AI. And to that intent, we actually set up an AI working group because we also found out that other specialties were also looking into AI, but nobody knew really how to begin bringing all the stakeholders together. So our trust really went on to do a much more system-wide as opposed to somebody working in a silo in a particular department and bring together everyone so that we had all the data governance teams, the research and development departments, the clinicians to bring together the data and the domain expertise to start thinking about how we could look into implementing. So we've taken a very proactive sort of strategic level approach to establishing how we actually look into doing real world studies. And our next step has been the way we look to solve our own problems and therefore then go down which particular AI company we want to show those implementation studies in. And this has been aided during the pandemic.
Okay, now, as a radiologist, radiology comes up a lot in this context because some AI gurus, I'm thinking about Andrew Ng and people like that, say that radiologists are the first people who are going to be replaced by AI and, your job can just be done by a machine. What do actual radiologists think about this and what do you think is really going to happen?
I don't have that kind of outlook. I actually have a very positive outlook. I think the potential of the AI-enabled technology is quite immense when it comes to showing true value for the patients that we serve. And radiology is basically part of a process in that workflow when a patient comes into the hospital to aid in either improving their health outcomes, essentially. So for me, radiology was always low-hanging fruit because the data is available and there's immense data available, whether it's the clinical symptoms systems or the PACS archiving systems. So companies have obviously gone straight where data was accessible. To what extent it was accessible and to what the quality level is still something that's coming out more and more. But I think that's why radiology was targeted initially. And I think the scope is huge. So I think as we look into integrating research with real world value studies, I think the scope is immense to really improve the population health outcomes.
So just to be clear, you think it's more likely that this makes existing radiologists, it helps them do their job, it increases the capacity to get through more work. Does it give you more time? Does it allow you to spend more time with patients and less time in basements poring over screens? I mean, how does it affect the actual practice of being a radiologist?
I think there'll be multiple ways in terms of, I do believe that radiologists, I think quite a few journals have come out saying that radiologists who augment their clinical skills with AI-enabled technology will be better off generally compared to radiologists who don't. And I'm a believer in that. So I think whether it's taking away the burden of administrative tasks or actually helping in a clinical workflow by triaging cancers so that we can really accelerate that pathway for the patient to get treatment faster and more accurately, I think AI has huge scope.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Paul Elliott now. Now, clearly, machine learning can be deployed very quickly at very large scale by the likes of Google and Facebook, but we've seen a rather different story. We're at a rather earlier stage in healthcare. What do you think can be done to make the use of AI in healthcare more translatable from research to a real-world context?
So, Tom, I lost you there, so I hope you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes, I can. Sorry. What?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there are particular challenges when we move from, as you say, sort of the Google collecting data on loads of things and being able to, find real patterns in the data to the health systems, because if you just look at any hospital, it doesn't have one system. It's historically got many, many systems, different systems in different organs and different specialties. And it's really trying to bring all those data together and having one electronic health record that you can really explore. And the quality of the data is going to be paramount. So you've got different clinicians entering data still in hospitals. We need to be moving much more to a sort of a very standardized approach to how we collect and hold those data. And of course, if we're going to use those data to explore patterns, people are very concerned about the governance around health data. I mean, people freely give their permission for search engines and whatever to use their data, but people are rightly concerned about their health data. And if you think that we're now getting, whole genome data being added to the health record for rare conditions, that's going to become much more common. And potentially, the genome can identify the individual, not only yourself, but other people. So I think getting the data right and getting the governance right is going to be absolutely critical to the use of these data going forward for machine learning type approaches. Having said that, the potential is very large because we've got very, very big data sets, not only with the health outcome data, but also with, if you like, exposure data, be it biological exposures that we can measure now with new technologies, not only the genome, but we can look at the proteome or the metabolome, the small metabolites in blood or in tissues. We can generate thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of data points on each individual, and trying to understand those patterns clearly is going to be very important. So using these methods intelligently is going to be very, very key. And it is going to require not just a black box approach with data scientists. It's going to be a team effort where you've got the medical people, the biologists who really understand the fundamentals of the data system to input into those models so that you can get a understandable and, as you say, translatable message, because what we're really interested in, what is causing the disease and how do we intervene to make things better? And to do that, we really have to have a lot of understanding and domain knowledge of the underlying biology.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask about, because this is a field which has been, to people who know how to use a machine learning system, they've got a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And I'm sure you'll all have seen the the paper in Nature Machine Learning by Roberts et al. Last week, which looked at 2,212 studies using machine learning, machine vision systems to diagnose COVID-19 from chest radiographs and CT scans. And it found that none of the models identified are of potential clinical use due to methodological flaws and or underlying biases. And this suggests that there is a sort of fundamental disconnect in the way that machine learning researchers are working and what clinicians and medical researchers actually need. So how do we address that, and how do we sort of connect these two communities more effectively?
Yeah, it's a major issue, and clearly for machine learning, you want to optimize your method and try and get the best prediction you can. But that might not necessarily be reproducible or translate into other data sets. And the problem is that the data sets are not held in the same way, and the structure of the data sets might be different. So there's a major task for the health community, and we're very fortunate we have a National Health Service. So potentially we can start working to the same structures. But until we do that, these models are not going to be very translatable. They're not going to be sort of able to be moved from one set of data to another, and that is a key impediment, I think, to making progress in this area.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to you now, Sylvia Richardson. You're a biostatistician using AI and statistical modelling and analysis rather than diagnosis. Can you give us some examples of how this technology can be used in modelling and the sorts of things you've been using it for?
Well, as you know, statistical analysis encompasses many types of data. So, for example, one type of data we really like to use is well-designed data, which is data where you have controlled many sources of heterogeneity, and then you could address causal questions easier. So all the type of trial data. Of course, this is this is the most interpretable type of data. Then you try to transfer these methods into investigating large database observational data, where the data just come in, and you need nevertheless to try to extract to take into account all the possible bias and selection bias of the data. So we have special tools to try to look at, how the missing patterns are, was there any evidence of selection bias. So, for example, people who just the example here in the COVID world is that people who were tested were people who were coming forth with symptoms. This is not the most of the data collected by the test of trace data. It's selected data, and if you want to get an idea of the true prevalence, then you need to combine it with design data, like, for example, Paul Elliott group is involved in this designed randomized survey. And, we are developed, so there gives you an indication of unbiased prevalence, but of course it has limits in terms of the granularity. So the typical type of way biostatistician look at that is develop overarching modular models, which kind of synthesize information both from the very large observational database, but anchored from some solid design data. So that's an evidence, that's some type of work. We've been involved with colleagues in machine learning statistical lab, which is an ATI and both the Turing and Royal Statistical Society lab, which is inside the Joint Biosecurity Center, where we are trying to put together, in particular, different sources of data to try to get a better picture of the prevalence. But this type of approach is generic, trying to use a good statistical framework to embed, for example, for precision medicine, different view that you could have from the genome to the metabolome, the proteome, and some of the more biomarkers is also a very important area of research in biostatistics, this kind of integrative model to actually being able to go from the genome towards the clinic and the treatment to try to understand the path, the biological path of the disease, and derive, for example, biomarkers, which could be then interpreted to stratify people or to target better treatment. And then at the end of that, you have the trial phase where you actually need to test the new treatment, but they can be informed, for example, by predictive biomarkers. So this is really a whole breadth of different tools. In common is trying to think very much about the origin, and like Paul was saying, the context of your data, whether it's observational, whether it's actually design data, and also trying to find ways of acknowledging what's uncertain and build that properly, build the statistical uncertainty and the heterogeneity of the data, because human data is incredibly heterogeneous, and build that in your model so you're not overconfident in your inference and in your predictions.
Well, let's bring this back to the pandemic if we can. Given all those challenges, what data or inference or computational infrastructure would you ideally have had in place, and what would you put in place in preparation for a future pandemic?
Well, as we started to discuss, I think the sort of unified data infrastructure for disease surveillance in preparedness, when the question here was, is AI a panacea? We'll say panacea is not the thing, but preparedness is one first keyword that you could use AI. And in that, you need both, on the one side, a unified data infrastructure. Paul Elliott was saying in hospital, the data is very fragmented, but in public health, the data is very fragmented. There's different data owners. There's the ONS, there's PHE, there is NHS, and we need to have to think about a unified data structure, which could be useful for for surveillance. That's the first thing. And where data streams come in, and you could add data streams. You need something modular, because you can't prepare for everything. But what you could prepare is for a structure which is agile and can incorporate new data streams as they come, quality check. So that's the first thing, is really a data infrastructure. And then associated to that, you need the methods, and you need both types of model. You need these kind of epidemiological models that we've seen, the sort of semi-mechanistic model, but you also need pure data-driven statistical models. But the key things is there need to be some talk between different models. So, for example, you have a model for prevalence that needs to be inputted in people who are looking at the effect of policies. So you need talk between models. We call that interoperability, and that needs to be planned from the start. And when you're designing, the analytic structure, so it's very important. And this cannot be done in a hurry, And we're trying to do that in a hurry, but we were just not prepared. And am
I right in thinking, though, that relatively speaking, we are in quite a good position in England with the NHS, in the sense that we do have a relatively, we have a single provider, as it were, and we do have quite a lot of centralized and standardized data. And I know there are problems that we have with, different systems not talking to each other and so on, but relative to other parts of the world, we're in a pretty good position, aren't we?
And the genetics, not only we've got the NHS, and of course, all our public health expertise, our AI expertise, and incredibly strong genetic expertise. We're world leading into genetic surveillance. So yes, we're absolutely well placed to do that and to achieve that. But it does need long-term commitment and investment and thinking in its globality. But yes, we absolutely will.
Okay, but more to be done, but we're in a relatively good position, but there's still room for improvement. Alistair Dennison, I'd like to come to you now, please. Looking forward, what would you highlight as the major barriers to the development and deployment of AI in health as we emerge from the pandemic?
So, Tom, thank you. Picking up on some of the themes that have emerged before, I would highlight 3 areas. Need for better data, which a number of people have touched on, and I'll come back to. Need for better evidence, and need for greater trust. And the last one is really important, and we've seen that illustrated through the pandemic as well in a number of domains. If we just come back to the better data, I would echo your point, Tom. I think that actually, relatively speaking, we were in a really strong position, which actually the pressures of the pandemic have accelerated. And that's across the United Kingdom, all 4 nations. There are different ways that the data is handled across the NHS systems, but actually there's been a really fantastic UK effort. And I'd particularly like to call out the role of Health Data Research UK in that space, HDR UK, and all the organisations across the UK who work in this space working together. And for those who are interested, there's a number of data sets, including COVID-related data sets, that can be visible online through something called the Innovation Gateway. So there's a real desire to make the data that exists not only accessible but visible, so that it's accessible to researchers to enable discovery that improves people's lives and can respond rapidly to challenges like a pandemic, to make those processes more efficient, to scale that data so they're not just stuck in silos but are linked, both within kind of data types, but also linking across, for example, my field of eye health data, connecting that to cardiovascular data, so we can use scans from the eyes to predict if somebody's going to run into kind of at risk of a heart attack or at risk of developing dementia. Some really powerful work coming from our collaborators around that. And so I think that the UK's position on data is strong and is rapidly accelerating. And I think you're right to point out to the role of the NHS there. We know that a lot of our systems are fragmented, like Paul pointed to, but actually they still exist within a kind of common set of governance and values that mean that this is a bridgeable gap. But coming back to your question to me, yes, that is a barrier to get to better data. And on data, the thing that mustn't be neglected is that we need inclusive data sets. We need data sets that are diverse and speak and are representative of the populations we serve. Now, that's always been true, that there's a danger that your biological understanding is based on a kind of very small cohort of the population. But with data-driven technologies, so the kind of broad realm of AI, that's even more important, because otherwise we'll develop tools that work really well in Cambridge, but don't work, say, in parts of Birmingham, or vice versa.
Now, I know you've done some work on health data poverty. Is that what you're talking about there? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, no, thanks. That was the phrase we coined to kind of really describe this, which was that there's great research that's been going on around the importance of data diversity for a long time, but it sounds quite nebulous, and what's the impact of that? But what we've been looking at is if you have these highly exclusive data sets, things that are perhaps generated just through research like the UK Biobank, which is a wonderful resource, but is not representative of the whole population, there's a danger that parts of society will be missed out on, and that when we'll end up with a kind of 2-track health system whereby AI tools come through that can be used safely in one part of the population, but actually if you don't tick all the boxes, you go into the kind of non-digital second pathway. And that's not a situation we want to get to. We want to make sure that AI tools we develop are built on highly inclusive data sets, validated on those data sets, and then can be deployed with confidence across the whole population in a fair, effective and safe manner. Yeah,
and that connects to the trust issue, clearly. It sounds as though what you're saying is, and this is a theme from all of you actually, that the data is the crucial challenge here, and it's not that we actually need the technology itself to get any better. We just need to figure out how to get the data to feed into it, and figure out the governance and all that sort of thing. Is that fair, Alistair?
So I think sometimes the things that you think are hard are easy, and vice versa. And I think this is one of those cases. So it's not that there's not scope for technology to get better. It's more that I think that the technology is good enough for it to make a real difference in the real world. We need to get the rest of it sorted. And Rita called it out at the beginning as well. one of the things is around getting our pathways right. So you're not taking a new shiny thing and trying to stick it onto an analog system. You actually need to make your hospital pathways and care pathways built around the patient, not based on yesterday's model, but around the patient and around that patient flow, and redesign it. And that's not for a single product. That's an AI-enabled pathway then that the best-in-class products can drop into and can be evaluated in a robust way. So that also means it's not just enough to be able to deploy the new product, the new tool. You have to be able to evaluate it safely. You've got to be able to detect when it might fail and mitigate for that. But coming back to your point, Tom, yes, I think the technology's here. It can always be improved. It's everything else we need to get right.
Okay, brilliant. I'd like to come back to Amrita Kumar on that, actually, because it does sound like how you actually integrate it in practice is the hard bit. So how do we overcome those barriers to implementation and adoption in practice? How are you approaching that challenge?
Thank you, Alistair and Tom. Now, that's quite interesting because what we saw during the pandemic, I told you about our journey just pre-pandemic. What we saw with the pandemic was essentially there was a kind of forced shift to use technology to actually enable work to go on in the NHS. So whether you're using medical telemedicine or virtual consultation, this was very much an initial forced shift. But along with that came the cultural acceptance, which has taken quite some time to get there within the NHS, because people are very wary of using technology because there are multiple issues that have to be addressed. But this cultural shift to acknowledging that AI and technology can aid in the pathway has been helped during the pandemic. And even right now, it's a lot more trusting that technology has a role. And I completely agree, there are multiple other factors, like keeping all the stakeholders involved, whether they're patients, clinicians, governance team members, actually bringing the biggest problem, and I think it's reflective of what everybody is saying, is that the very few people that are actually aware of the problem domain and the technical feasibility of bringing these two things together, because what we see is data usually goes away from one place to another place, but the skill associated with interpreting that data for that local population level is lost. So I think somehow aligning and bringing together so that we have some sort of trusted research environment at a local level, but in multiple places, not just in one place, so that we can have the robustness of data and the variation, because our population level has multiple different types of people with different behavioral and social determinants, but it stays in that place. People come in, try to establish that link between problem solving and the technical side, because as Alistair said, technology is here and it's good enough to really bring value to what we could find if we enabled it with AI.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, Paul, what your take was on this question of trust and transparency and patient involvement.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that we bring patients and the public along with us. So, for example, Sylvia mentioned that we're running this very large survey during the pandemic called the REACT program, where we've actually invited over 2 million people to take part in our studies, looking at both the spread of the virus itself and also looking at antibody response to the virus and latterly to vaccine. That sort of big database does lend itself to the sorts of technologies we're talking about. And in fact, we have been using machine learning approaches, for example, to look at symptom clusters amongst both amongst people who test positive and don't test positive, and it's been quite successful. But to do that, we very much from the beginning have involved the public. We have a very strong public engagement group, and not only do we involve them, say this is what we'd like to do, and that's sort of telling people, we actually involve them in the design. So, for example, we did a big study looking at use of lateral flow tests for antibody, and frankly, the sorts of things you got from the manufacturers were not fit for purpose in terms of very large scale at-home testing. To do at-home testing, you've got to involve the public, because can you use it? Would you use it? Would you know how to use it? And we actually used our patient group to help us do that. it's got to be partnership. And you know, we want to do, for example, now we're collecting, I mentioned omic data, which is this very large scale biological data, not only getting the genome off on people who've tested positive in our study, but also lots of other biological markers, proteins, metabolites, and so forth, and transcription. So to do that, we'll have a huge database. It will include genomic data, and our participants really need to be on board to understand how we're going to use those data. And why are we collecting it? Because we want to understand, as Sylvia was saying, those biological connections, the causal pathways. We know that the genetic signals, we can get a very robust genetic signal, but we don't know why a genetic signal relates to a health outcome. What is happening in between in terms of the transcription of the genetic data, the proteins that are formed, and the metabolism within ourselves, in our bodies, that then determine what, you know, that may lead on to long COVID or to disease or whatever it might be. And we really want to understand those connections. So it's really important we collect the data, but we cannot collect the data and use those data if we don't have the public and the patients and the participants on board. So it is a dialogue, and it's got to be a shared vision, because ultimately we're all trying to do the same thing, which is improve treatment, management, and prevention of disease.
Sylvia Richardson, I'd like to bring you back in on this and this question of trust, because it's not just the question of the public establishing a trust with the medical profession. There's also the role of policymakers and the way they present this sort of evidence. How can we encourage transparency and accountability between all of these groups?
Yes, I think there is I think it's to get, education, getting people to understand that, you know, decisions are made step by step based on the available evidence, and that recognizing, particularly when we are in a crisis, that, you know, evidence is built gradually, and you have to acknowledge the limitation of your evidence. You have to capture uncertainty, and this is not detrimental to public trust. On the contrary, this will help public trust. So you have to acknowledge that you have to make decision, that this decision will need to be adapted as new evidence comes in, and what you're doing about collecting new evidence. And then people actually and policymakers understand that, you know, the transparency of the process and the education, in the fact that uncertainty and showing the limitation is a good way of getting people trust and getting things adopted. I think that's absolutely crucial. And unfortunately, I think this is not something which comes naturally to policymakers. So, and also evaluation can be built on very quickly into any deployment. For example, Paul was talking about lateral flow tests and their deployment, where, you know, you could decide that you can't wait for doing something. This is absolutely fine, because something needs to be done and planned in advance. But you could at the same time role in context evaluation and not just rely on manufacturers' quantification of the operational characteristic of the test. You can plan that together, and I think that that's very important to get this message across, that, you know, the uncertainty can be captured while you're making decision, if you need to. Of course, you know, if you have longer time scale, you could do things sequentially, but when you are in a crisis, it doesn't mean you have to stop evaluating and communicating uncertainty. And so really, I mean, David Spiegelhalter has made there's a very nice Nature commentary where they have these 5 rules of evidence communication. And I think that this would apply to any, that could be tailored, you know. So one is disclose uncertainty, and one is inform and not, you know, persuade. And I think that the difference between information and persuasion is really important. And you could think of that in the context of the claims made about AI algorithm. We need to inform about their limitation, and they will carry on improving, as Alistair was saying, when we're collecting multi-stream data to train them. We will train them better on more realistic data and better documented data, and these algorithms will improve. But we need to inform about their limitation and not just try to persuade that they're the magic. There's no AI magic in this business.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's raise our eyes to the horizons a bit, though, because lots of grand claims are made about the potential of this technology. So let's contrast those grand claims with where you think the potential actually is. This is actually a question from Alistair to everyone else. So perhaps I can come to you first, Amrita Kumar. What do you see as the major opportunities for AI in health in the post-pandemic era? Where are the easy wins? Where are the long-term opportunities? Where do you think we should be focusing? And then I'll come to you, Paul, after that.
So thank you for that, Tom. I think for me, because I'm a clinician at heart, it'll always come back to looking at a population health for, say, our patch of land, where we serve 1.2 million residents. So for me, the future will be actually really realizing the potential, that longitudinal data potential, and connecting that primary care community data with the hospital data, because now the technology exists to connect both together. So instead of reacting to patients in a sort of episodic, very reactive way when they come with a problem into the hospital, we'll actually have that longitudinal flow so that we can move more towards preventative, continuous monitoring and risk stratification, so that the patients can be managed in their homes without the need to actually come into hospital, because we'll realize what risks those individuals have based on all the data that's already present within the system. It's just not organized in that longitudinal fashion. So for me, it's the risk stratification and the prevention that I think holds true value.
Absolutely. Paul Elliott, what's your take on sort of where the biggest opportunity lies here? You're on mute.
I completely agree with Amrita about the value of the electronic health record with longitudinal data that captures the clinical information that will be available on everyone, not just through hospital systems, but actually through primary care as well. And getting that longitudinal record is going to be really important. But on top of that, there are tremendous opportunities for extra data to come in. Wearable technology, a lot of people are using wearable technologies already. That gives much more granular information about potentially about their health and also about their lifestyle. And if we think more generally, environmental data sets, what people eat, all these things are amenable to high throughput data capture that can be linked in some way. And then on top of that, you've got the biological data that I was talking about. The genomic data, which at the moment is very much for very particular groups of people, where there may be suspicion or concern about a genetic cause of the disease, and in research databases such as UK Biobank that was mentioned, where already we have coming data on 500,000 people and their full genome sequence. So these are tremendous opportunities for novel discovery. And add to that the other biological data that were also coming on stream, the other omic technologies, so that you really will be able to follow through from the genetic signal to, if you like, opening up what's called the black box between, something at the left-hand side and there's an outcome at the right-hand side, and you don't really know what's going on in between. And that's not good enough if you want to develop new treatments, because you really got to understand the biology and the chemistry so you can actually intervene.
Well, what about this, the sort of thing that, DeepMind has been doing with AlphaFold, and, and Demis Hassabis also talks about the potential for AI to be accelerate medical research. Maybe it's text analysis of large volumes of medical research papers that no human could ever read. Maybe it's, predicting the shapes of proteins. But I mean, what do we all think of the potential of that? Is that sort of sci-fi further away and we need to be focusing on the nitty gritty of hospital databases, or do you think there's that's something that could turn into real progress in the next few years? Anyone want to come back on that one?
If I may, it's not the nitty gritty of hospital. I think what Paul was talking was really an integrative view of a person, biological makeup and disease, and longitudinal disease trajectory into its environment. And I think that is definitely, that's also what Amrita and Alistair were mentioning, and I think, for example, from a statistical data science point of view, it's quite a challenge to be able to integrate this data into something which is useful at the end, translatable and useful and testable, evaluated as well. So just because of the size of the data and because there are so many different signals, you might not always extract, you might get lost in the way. Some very interesting thing, but not really driven towards your clinical goals. So despite you need a lot of different facets of basically what you're capturing on a person to try to make that journey, but you cannot dig blind into it. So I think multidisciplinarity and combining expertise in multidisciplinary teams, from genetics, biologists, clinicians, and so on, and for them to try to understand the power of AI, the power of, the tools that we can bring to the statistical thinking that we could bring to the problem, and having a suitable dialogue. So it's not, the modeling is not thought as something separate. The model is built around the knowledge that everybody can bring to the problem towards the goal. And I think that's a big challenge.
Oh, absolutely. Well, funnily enough, that's Paul Elliott's question to all of you is on exactly that topic. So I'd like to ask Alistair on this one first. How do we best train the next generation of researchers to make progress, given the need for these multidisciplinary skills, as we've just heard? What's your thought on that, Alistair Denniston?
So I think, again, we can look at some things that are happening in this space and celebrate them. So the Alan Turing Institute, I think, has a really powerful voice and is great influence in this space. I think university sectors are really woken up to the kind of the importance and the opportunity here. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of areas of sort of local excellence, and then a degree of sort of national strategy overlying the top of that. That doesn't mean that there's not more to be done. I think absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is when you see the multidisciplinary groups building up. So right the way through this conversation, people have talked about teams and people talking to each other. And I think having those who have domain expertise in health and the kind of biological systems, and those who have the domain expertise in the computational systems, the statistics, and actually right from early on, the usability, it often gets forgotten, but how does this then get deployed, and the kind of evaluation expertise, the methodology, in designing the evaluations, whether that's a formal clinical trial or not. But coming back to your point, Tom, so I think it's more of what we're already doing, but it's also, there is something around, I think, that making the health system itself attractive for really smart people coming through who want to build these systems. So we know that the kind of the funded space within health, within the NHS may not be able to compete with other sectors, and so I think there's something about communicating what the rewards are of working in this space. I mean, I wouldn't be anywhere else. I'm passionate about making a difference to patients I serve through helping develop these technologies and bringing them through to the coalface to help people.
Great, thank you. And Rita Kumar, what's your take on the sort of the talent development and how you develop these multidisciplinary people that we're going to need?
Thank you, Tom. I'd have to say I agree with Alistair, and I'd echo what he's saying. From a clinician and a clinical point of view, because a clinician should be part of this journey, especially as we're also looking at clinicians who are not associated directly with academic institutions, but would like to be part of the journey because they're involved in the real world evaluation studies, to actually raise awareness at our local medical school level, at training level, that there are multiple now courses, be it if they're on your own time through the multiple online courses that are free and otherwise available, just to raise the awareness. And this should be part of the curriculum from our side, so that people have, just like research, not everybody is a born researcher, but everybody as a clinician should know the principles of research, because it's very important to know, and then you can develop that should that be where your interest lies. I think the technology and the data side of things has to be inbuilt into the curriculum going forward.
Great. Okay, now I'd like to take some questions from our audience. So we're going to start with a question for Paul. This is a question from Ray Chen, who asks, how do we deal with AI failure in medical care if it occurs, and who should be held accountable for it if it does occur?
That's a good question. So these algorithms that might be developed for treatment of particular conditions, for example, renal failure has been one, or septic shock, they need to undergo intensive evaluation and then validation, and then buy-in from the clinicians, because at the end of the day, it's still a clinical decision. It's not an AI decision. So the AI will point you to a problem, but it's the clinician who has to take responsibility. But the failures should not, I think failure is probably the wrong word. It is, if you like, sensitivity of the system. And what you want is the clinical view plus a system that is intelligent, that helps you make good decisions, ultimately. And you've got to really test that the system does what it says on the tin. Otherwise, you shouldn't be adopting it. And this is where, coming back to the NHS, we really do have a fantastic opportunity in the NHS, because we have one system across the country to really develop these things and then implement and test them elsewhere, and then come up with clinical guidelines that might incorporate an algorithm that will help the clinician, but ultimately still, in my view, is the clinical, not a AI decision.
Okay, no, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. This is a question for Sylvia from somebody anonymous, and it says, do you see that there are barriers to integration of this sort of technology in healthcare because of an over-reliance on traditional techniques and a reluctance to change?
No, I wouldn't say. I think people are, in my experience, people are really open to change, but they need to be convinced that, of the trustworthiness and the impact and the benefit of the change. So I think people, I could see there's a lot of excitement with associated, help for decision and clinical decision from the AI, as Amrita was saying. But I think the trustworthiness of the algorithm and how they're trained, so being able to explain basically from the start, even if there's something, there's a deep learning machine underneath, it doesn't matter. You have to start to try to explain the key feature that it's relying on, their ways of looking at. You have to say what data went in, and how you have tested it, and if you're actually able to make things much more explainable and enter in this dialogue, I think you will break lots of these barriers. There's no harm in comparing a very sophisticated thing to a standard multivariate logistic as well, because I think it shows then what the benefit. You mustn't discard the traditional, some basic multivariate model are very good at predicting in many situations. And so
no, of course, we don't want to use new things just for the sake of it. I take your point. Thank you. This is a question for Alistair. How are regulators and policymakers being involved in the development of technologies for health from the start? And this is a question from Patricia Holly.
That's a great question. So one thing to say is that the regulator in this space in the UK is the MHRA, and they've got fantastic experience and a program of work looking at how we regulate AI effectively. I think that's something I very much hope to see kind of continue to grow, because obviously it's a very early space. So I think we have an opportunity within the UK to really globally lead in this. And regulation is often something that switches people off, but it's absolutely key. It's if we want to improve care for patients, we need regulatory systems that can efficiently flow through what works and efficiently block what doesn't. So I think key question here. So the challenge is, though, that regulators often see these, they may have the right framework, but they often see these products very late. And so it's often not the regulators who directly interact with the developers and the manufacturers until quite late in the process. But if they're wise, the developers and innovators do seek advice either directly from the regulators or from people who know the regulatory framework really early. And they should be really clear about the intended use. So often what we see, and I'm sure Amrita will have seen this as well, is products coming through and you said, so where is it meant to be used in the pathway? You can say, oh, well, you can use it here. I say, what about there? And they say, oh, you could use it there too. And actually the evidence that they may provide is maybe unrelated to any of those actual settings. And so therefore you can't be really confident about the performance in your desired area. So I think it's the question touches on that issue, that there's a need to define the intended use early, to gather the evidence that supports that, and to be really clear, if you're not speaking to the regulators directly, to be really clear as to what they will be looking for before deployment. Great, thank you very much. We've only got about 2 minutes left now, so I'm going to ask you all just to wrap up the same question. So a one or two sentence answer from each of you, please. Basically, where do you expect to see the most progress in the use of AI tools in medicine in the next decade? And Rita, let's start with you.
I think for me, it'll be care virtualization and risk stratification for patients. So if we can reduce, really look at reducing, say, the inequity that exists in all the areas, so that the treatment can be personalized to the different groups, that would be really good.
Great, thank you. Paul, what's your take on what we should look out for in the next decade?
Yeah, so I'll take a research perspective. I think biological discovery, I think we're at the cusp of being able to make fantastic new discoveries. As we said earlier, it's not going to just be the technology, but the technology be a really key part of that.
Great, thank you. Sylvia, what's your take?
Well, my take is that I think we can really do much better disease surveillance, and this is going to be increasingly important as they're coming, because we know that these pandemics will come again and again. So I think there's big potential in planning disease surveillance. And besides that, I would say robust way of doing integrative analysis, the data synthesis for patient care is where I see a big development.
Great, thank you. And finally, Alistair, what's your take?
Yeah, so I think it will be the equivalent of kind of, if you take the driverless car analogy, it would be sort of driver assistance becoming more and more sophisticated, helping me and Anne-Marie to be safer doctors and more effective doctors without replacing us at this stage. So it's, driver assistance.
Excellent. That's a very nice way of putting it. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions. And most of all, thank you to our panelists for a fascinating and enlightening discussion. Thank you to Alistair Dennison, Sylvia Richardson, Amrita Kumar and Paul Elliott. It's goodbye from them and it's goodbye from me. Thank you. Bye-bye.